The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin, steady and monotonous, but it wasn't enough to drown out the shrill cries that pierced through every row. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pressing earbuds deeper into their ears, others sighing audibly, a few shooting annoyed glances toward the source of the noise. In the first-class cabin, a man in a tailored suit sat rigidly, his strong jaw set, his dark brows furrowed. Alexander Grant was no ordinary passenger. He was a self-made millionaire, the type of man who commanded boardrooms, negotiated mergers worth millions, and never lost control of a situation. Yet here, 35,000 feet in the air, he was powerless against the wails of his own infant son. The baby's face was red with frustration, tiny fists flailing as he refused the bottle Alexander tried to coax between his lips. The nanny at his side, flustered and near tears herself, whispered hurried apologies. "Sir, I don't know why he won't settle. I've tried rocking him, I've tried the pacifier, he just won't stop." Alexander's temples throbbed. He could feel the weight of 100 eyes on him, silently judging, criticizing, perhaps even mocking the irony. The great Alexander Grant, the man who could bend economies to his will, undone by a 10-pound infant. He adjusted his cufflinks, more to steady his hands than out of necessity, and muttered under his breath, "He's just a baby. He has to stop eventually." But even he didn't believe it. The flight attendant appeared again, her professional smile cracking at the edges. "Mr. Grant, would you like me to bring some warm water, perhaps another bottle? Sometimes a little change helps." "I've tried everything," he snapped, harsher than he intended, but his patience was running thin. The attendant gave a sympathetic nod and retreated, though her glance toward the other passengers betrayed her worry about the mounting complaints. In the back of the plane, tucked into an economy seat by the window, a young woman sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her name was Emily Hayes, though no one here knew it. She wasn't the type to draw attention to herself. Her clothes were modest, her long hair partially hiding her face, and her eyes stayed fixed on the book open in her lap, though she hadn't read a word in 20 minutes. Instead, she listened. She felt the cries vibrate through her chest, each sound carrying a desperation she couldn't ignore. Something inside her stirred, an ache she recognized all too well from years of caring for children in the small daycare she once worked at. Babies didn't cry like this without reason. But what could she do? She wasn't anyone important. She wasn't bold enough to walk up to a millionaire in first class and tell him he was doing it wrong. Just the thought made her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her and tried to block out the judgmental whispers around her. A man a few seats over muttered, "If he can afford first class, he can afford to keep his kid quiet." A woman across the aisle sighed loudly, "Some people shouldn't travel with infants." Emily winced. The words weren't fair. She stole a glance toward the front of the cabin. She could just barely see Alexander standing, bouncing the child awkwardly in his arms, his expression caught between frustration and helplessness. Her heart squeezed. The baby's cries sounded hoarse now, a sign of exhaustion, yet he still refused to settle. She turned her gaze back to her book, staring at the blurred lines of text. Her pulse raced as a thought kept creeping into her mind, "You could help." But the other voice inside her was louder, "Don't embarrass yourself. He doesn't need you. You'll just look foolish." Still, she couldn't shake the pull in her chest. She remembered the countless times she had soothed babies just like this, how sometimes all it took was a calm presence, a lullaby, a different rhythm of rocking. She could picture herself stepping forward, asking quietly if she might try. She imagined his skeptical look, the passengers' stares. The heat rose in her cheeks again, and she bit her lip. Up ahead, Alexander collapsed back into his seat, cradling the still crying child against his chest. His broad shoulders sagged with defeat, a sight Emily never thought she'd see in a man like him. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the distance of the cabin, his, sharp and weary, hers, soft but hesitant. She quickly looked away, heart pounding, but the image of that helpless father stayed burned into her thoughts. The cries carried on, relentless, and Emily knew she couldn't hide behind her shyness forever. Something inside her whispered that before this flight ended, she would have to act. The baby's cries grew louder, echoing through the cabin like an alarm that refused to be silenced. Passengers shifted more restlessly, some glaring openly now. A man in business attire pressed the flight attendant button repeatedly, while another muttered under his breath about refunds. The flight attendants exchanged worried looks as they moved up and down the aisle, but every suggestion, warm milk, another pacifier, even dimming the cabin lights, failed. Nothing soothed the infant. Alexander's jaw tightened as he adjusted his hold on his son, trying to mimic the way he had once seen his late wife cradle the child. But his movements were stiff, mechanical, lacking the natural rhythm babies seemed to respond to. He bounced too fast, then too slow, and the child's wails only sharpened. Sweat prickled at his collar despite the cool air of the cabin. He was not used to failing, and certainly not in public. Every annoyed glance from a passenger felt like a dagger to his pride. The nanny, pale and near tears, whispered apologetically, "Sir, I don't know what else to do." He usually calms down. "I swear, I've never seen him like this." Alexander barely restrained a groan. He wanted to snap, to release the frustration building in his chest, but what good would that do? He looked down at his son, the small red face streaked with tears, and felt something heavy settle in his chest. He could silence a boardroom with a single word, sway markets with his decisions, but here he was, utterly useless when it came to the one life that mattered most. Meanwhile, Emily sat frozen in her economy seat, her fingers clenched around her book though she hadn't turned a page in half an hour. The longer she listened, the harder it became to ignore the aching instinct inside her. Every cry pulled at her heartstrings, reminding her of the children she had once cared for, tiny humans who needed patience, warmth, and gentle reassurance. She knew she could help. She knew it in her bones. But then her timid nature screamed back, "You'll look ridiculous. He's a millionaire. He doesn't want some nobody interfering. People will laugh at you." She glanced at the flight attendants clustered near the galley, whispering in urgent tones. Their polite smiles had long since slipped, replaced with pinched expressions that showed their desperation to quiet the growing unrest among passengers. The situation wasn't just uncomfortable anymore, it was teetering toward chaos. Her heart pounded as she looked toward first class again. Alexander's composure was unraveling. His broad shoulders slumped as he tried rocking his son again, his lips pressing into a tight line of frustration. For a moment, Emily thought she saw something raw flicker in his expression, something more vulnerable than annoyance. A quiet plea, perhaps. Her throat tightened. "If you don't act now, no one will." She inhaled shakily, her palms damp. The weight of her own fear pressed down on her, but the sound of the baby's cries gave her courage she didn't know she had. Before she could stop herself, Emily unclipped her seatbelt and rose to her feet. The movement drew a few curious glances, but she barely noticed. Her knees felt like jelly, but somehow her legs carried her down the aisle, one hesitant step at a time. As she neared first class, she could feel her face burning under the gaze of passengers who now turned to see what she was doing. The baby's cries grew louder with every step, but instead of pushing her back, they pushed her forward. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke, quiet but clear enough to reach Alexander. "Excuse me. I might be able to help." The cabin seemed to fall into stunned silence for a moment. Alexander looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the young woman standing awkwardly in the aisle. She looked so small, so uncertain, but there was something in her gaze that made him pause. Desperation and pride battled within him, but the cries in his arms left him with little choice. He hesitated, his jaw tightening, then finally gave a curt nod. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had done it. She had spoken. Now there was no turning back. The baby's cries rattled the air, sharp and desperate, but Emily felt her own trembling settle into a strange calm as Alexander shifted and handed the infant into her arms. For a brief second, her heart seized. This was no ordinary baby, not just because he belonged to a man like Alexander Grant, but because he was so small, so vulnerable, and now entirely dependent on her. The passengers watched in tense silence, 100 pairs of eyes trained on her every movement. Emily drew in a steadying breath, letting her instincts guide her. She held the baby close, supporting his head with gentle care, and began to sway softly. Her movements weren't rigid or forced. They carried the natural rhythm of someone who had done this countless times before. The cries didn't stop immediately, but they shifted, less piercing, more uncertain, as though the infant sensed something different in the arms that now cradled him. Alexander watched, his posture stiff, arms crossed over his chest. He was a man used to control, and here he was, surrendering his child into the hands of a complete stranger. Skepticism lined his features, but beneath it was a flicker of something else, a fragile hope he didn't want to admit to. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper when she began to hum, the melody trembling at first but growing steadier as it filled the cabin. It wasn't a song she had planned. It rose from memory, a lullaby she had once sung to a little girl at the daycare where she worked. The soft tune floated above the hum of the engines, weaving its way through the tense silence of the plane. The baby shifted against her chest, tiny fists unclenching. The cries dwindled into hiccuping whimpers, then into small sighs. Within minutes, the child's eyes fluttered shut, his breathing evening out as he drifted into sleep. A collective breath seemed to release across the cabin. Passengers leaned back in their seats, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling faintly at the sight. The man who had been demanding refunds earlier muttered, "Well, I'll be damned," while the woman across the aisle softened her expression, her earlier irritation replaced with quiet awe. Alexander stared, frozen. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the sight of his son, peaceful, content, asleep, nestled against this timid woman he had never met before. He felt an odd twist in his chest, a mix of relief, gratitude, and something sharper. He had tried everything, and yet it was this stranger's lullaby that had soothed his child. Emily kept humming a moment longer, unwilling to break the fragile spell too soon. Her voice faded softly, and she glanced up shyly, her cheeks warm as she realized the weight of so many eyes on her. She looked down quickly, adjusting her hold on the baby to shield him from the bright overhead lights. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but for the first time since boarding the plane, she felt she had done something right. Alexander cleared his throat, the sound rougher than usual. What did you do?" His voice was low, as though he didn't want to disturb the calm that had settled over his son. Emily's eyes lifted briefly to his, then dropped again. "Nothing special. Babies can feel tension. He just needed someone calm." Her words were quiet, but they carried a truth that hit Alexander harder than he expected. Calm. That was something he hadn't been able to give his son, no matter how hard he tried. He felt exposed in a way he never had before, standing there in his expensive suit, realizing he could command empires but not his own child's comfort. For a moment, he simply stared at Emily, unsure what to say, his gratitude tangled with the sting of inadequacy. Passengers began to murmur again, but this time with relief, some even smiling at Emily in thanks. The tense, suffocating atmosphere had shifted into something gentler, almost tender. Emily rocked the baby a little longer, her movements instinctive, her presence radiating a warmth that seemed to quiet not only the child but the entire cabin. For the first time in hours, peace returned to the flight. And though Alexander tried to maintain his usual composure, he couldn't shake the realization that this shy, unassuming woman had done the unthinkable. She had succeeded where he had failed. When the plane finally began its slow descent, the cabin lights brightened, and the announcement of landing filled the speakers. Yet for once, the passengers weren't restless or irritated. They were calm, subdued, almost protective of the fragile peace that had settled over the aircraft. In Emily's arms, the baby slept soundly, his tiny chest rising and falling against her cardigan as though he'd never screamed at all. She looked down at him with a tender smile, brushing a lock of soft hair from his damp forehead. Alexander had been silent for a long while, sitting beside her now rather than across the aisle. He had insisted on moving to the seat next to her after she'd managed the impossible, and though he didn't say much, his sharp gaze had rarely left his child, or her. He wasn't a man accustomed to silence. Usually, his words filled boardrooms with authority, yet here, he found himself with none. He simply watched, as if studying her every movement might reveal how she had done it. Emily felt his eyes but didn't dare look up. She was too aware of the weight of what had happened, too afraid that if she met his gaze, he might see how nervous she really was. The lullaby had come from instinct, not bravery. She was still the same timid woman who preferred to melt into the background. But for one brief moment, she had stepped forward, and that moment had changed everything. When the baby stirred softly in her arms, Alexander leaned in, his voice low. "You've done more for him in 10 minutes than I managed in hours." His tone was rough, almost reluctant, but there was no mistaking the sincerity beneath it. Emily's cheeks warmed. She shifted slightly, keeping her voice gentle so as not to wake the child. You were just too close to the problem. Babies can sense when we're stressed. It doesn't mean you can't comfort him. It just means he needed a different kind of calm this time. Her words were simple, but they struck deeper than she realized. Alexander sat back, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes softened. He wasn't a man who accepted weakness in himself, yet here he was, humbled by a shy stranger who had shown him what all his wealth and power could not buy, peace for his son. As the wheels touched down and the plane jolted slightly, passengers let out the usual sighs of relief, but this time, many glanced at Emily with smiles of quiet gratitude. A few even whispered thanks as they passed by her seat, their earlier annoyance forgotten. She nodded shyly, her face pink, unused to being the center of attention. When it was time to disembark, Emily carefully handed the sleeping baby back to Alexander. The transfer was gentle, almost reverent, as though neither of them wanted to break the fragile bond formed during the flight. Their hands brushed briefly, a fleeting contact that sent a strange spark through her. She quickly pulled back, tucking her hands into her sleeves. Alexander looked down at his son, then back at Emily. His voice was quieter this time, stripped of the arrogance he usually carried. I don't often say this, but, thank you. You've done more than you know. Emily swallowed, managing a small smile. You don't need to thank me. He just needed someone to listen to him. For a man like Alexander, who measured gratitude in contracts and numbers, her words were disarming. She spoke not for recognition, but out of simple truth. And it unsettled him in a way that was oddly refreshing. As passengers shuffled off the plane, Alexander lingered, adjusting his hold on the baby. He hesitated, then asked, at least let me return the favor somehow. Dinner. A proper thank you. Emily blinked, her heart stuttering at the unexpected offer. She wasn't sure what surprised her more, the invitation itself or the vulnerability behind it. But before she could answer, a flight attendant urged her forward with the departing crowd, and the moment slipped away. Walking down the jet bridge, Emily felt her pulse racing. She told herself it was over, that once they went their separate ways, she'd return to her quiet life, invisible and ordinary. And yet, deep inside, she knew this wasn't the last time she would cross paths with Alexander Grant. Because sometimes, even a timid voice, when brave enough to act, could change the course of someone else's story, and perhaps, her own.